I was actually born on the 6th of May, 1932, at Ichetlope, just outside Adams Mission. That's where I grew up. My father worked for the railways. He was actually working not as a garden boy, but he was a kitchen boy in Point, working for the firemen, for the train that was running between Point and Maidenhof. I don't know how long ago, but it was definitely in the 19th century. I went to school at Nongwane, which is near Chetope and near Adams Mission. My mother was never a kitchen girl. She got married and worked in the fields at home. I went to school at Nongwane in 1942. And in 1949, the school went up to standard 5. In 1949, I went to St. Magdalene's. St. Magdalene's is just at Mbogitwini, very close to African explosives and chemical industries. I was there up to 1950. I finished my standard 7 in 1950. And then I had to go to high school. As a Catholic, I had to choose between going to Mariatal, which is in Itopo, and Marian Hill. But ultimately, I went to Mariatal because the boarding fees were cheaper. So I was at Mariatal. I was at Mariatal from 1951 to 1953. And that was a very crucial time in the history of the black people in South Africa, because I went to Mariatal soon after the Group Areas Act, and soon after 1948, after the nationalists had won the election and they were changing things. But we were not aware as youngsters about those. Our eyes were opened by the events that followed after 1948. So in 1950, I completed standard 7. I started at Mariatal in the high school in 1951. It was just 2 years before the passage of Bantu Education Act number 47 of 1953. Again, we were not aware of that, but we were beginning to read the newspapers and following the news gradually. And to a certain extent, some of our teachers spoke about things which affected us with regarding to the changes in the education system, when in actual fact, education at that time for blacks, whites and all was the same. Although the schools were separated as it is, the syllabus was the same. They were following the same syllabus. You wrote the same examination in different centers. But now, for a change, the government was introducing the system of education which was for black people as a separate race. And we were gradually becoming aware of this. And in 1952, we were somehow disturbed by the news everywhere in the newspapers during the time of Defiance campaign. In fact, it was quite a pleasant, it was a kind of something which we didn't take seriously at that time, because to hear that so many people have been put in jail because they were sitting where they were not supposed to sit, where in the seats for the so-called Europeans. So they were taken to jail and they did this. MP Yengwa is one of those people, and Moses Mapita that we remember were being rounded up because they've been at the station, they were sitting in the seats which are marked Europeans only, and then they were detained and so forth. During that time, the missionaries themselves, the priests and the sisters, to a certain extent, they seem to have, they had sympathy with, from what we could gather from the whites, and the kind of disobedience that was given to the government of the day was not acceptable for them. So it so happened that because the kind of food that we were given was not nice food, we had soup with bean weevils, which we had to take back to the kitchen. And that was regarded as a defiance against the kitchen staff who were sisters. And Sister Iwara, who was actually the head of the primary school, and not even the head of the high school, because Sister Alcantara was the head of the high school, reported the matter to Peter Marisbeck and Mr. Oscroft, who was actually the inspector in charge of the area, Etopo and all, Midland West it was called. Came to school, and some of us who were already doing junior certificate were rounded up. I was a prefect at that time, so I was the first to be questioned about the strike. I explained what it had happened, and we were given a very strong warning that we shouldn't actually do that. But we did not know exactly what is it that we had done which was actually offending the authorities. That was the beginning of things, because in 1953, again, a certain young man who was in, I think, in Standard 8, Protest Kabende, was caned by Father von Quart severely because he had been seen standing with the girls on the girls' end. He was not only chamboked, but he was also expelled. It was a Sunday on the 5th of October, that particular day. And so the students went to meet Father von Quart in the rectory. He didn't actually open the door, and they gathered there. Personally, I wasn't there because there was a function. I was a head prefect, and my assistant was Walter Njisane, who was the brother of Professor of Mr. Njisane, who was a lecturer in sociology at the University of Natal, later a professor. We were actually looking after the doors in the concert which was sponsored by St. Anne's Sodality. And whilst we were there was a gunshot, and we realized that the boys were running away because Brother Alex, who was in the rectory and who also was aware that the boys were actually wanting to have a meeting with Father von Quart, and he was hiding himself, so he fired this shot to frighten them, and they went back. And at that time we came out, the women and all, and there was chaos. After a very short time, the police from Itopo were already in the premises. And then for the next 2 days, they were actually in the mission to keep things down. I don't want to go very far with that. I will hasten to say that 3 days after that, it was on the Sunday, the 5th, and Monday the 6th, the 7th, on the 8th, on Wednesday, some of us were asked to pack our things and go. And whilst we were packing our things, some of us did not. 8 of us out of 26 students were being expelled. Were asked to go away. We were not allowed to go to pack our things. Instead, 3 private cars were waiting, and with the police in plain clothes were taken to Itopo. We landed in custody for 21 days, charged for public violence. Now that's the beginning, when we began to open our eyes. In fact, our teacher, our science teacher, Mr. Mlonyen, was expelled on the same day. And it is him who, in actual fact, helped our parents to know our whereabouts. Having left our books, our boxes and everything, and locked up, and we were in custody for 21 days. Mr. Mlonyen had to contact Dr. W.Z. Tonko Wilson, who was practicing at Mzimkulu. Tonko was a prominent ANC member at the time. And then they organized our parents, and they got the lawyers and put Mary's back. And then the case was on, but we were detained for 21 days. We were not allowed to write the examination at Mariatal. Instead, we were transferred to go and write our examination at Lorem in Taylor Street in Durban. We had to go and write examination having not studied, having been in prison. And that was the beginning of the story of our involvement in politics at the time. That was the beginning of things when we began to realize that although the men of cloth were here to help us to know God and to love one another and to be one in the mystical body of Christ, that we were actually not one in the mystical body of Christ when it came to life as it was lived at that day. So we failed the junior certificate examination, and then by that time we were indexed. We were not go to schools, to be admitted in schools for the next 5 years in the province of Natal. Now that was the beginning of the career, and then I went to work at Ilovo Sugar Estate as a clerk, and subsequently went to Jacobs, Consolidated Textile Mills at Frame. And in these two places, I realized that I wasn't going to last long. At Ilovo Sugar Estate, there were 3 shifts. One was at 6 to 2 a.m., and then the next shift starts at 2 a.m. to 10 in the morning, and the next one is 10 to 6. There were 3 shifts, and I realized this was no place for me. I went to Consolidated Textile Mills. It was the same thing. There were 2 shifts. The first shift was at 7 in the morning and finished at 4:29, and then sometimes 4:29, and there were 2 shifts. I couldn't tolerate, and it was then that I decided to go to Baker Street, where there were inspectors of school, and there I approached Hamilton Makanya, who was actually the first inspector of native schools in Natal in 1920. I knew Hamilton Makanya from St. Magdalene's in 1949, and exactly in 1950 when I was doing Standard 7, because Mr. Makanya brought Professor Reader from Cambridge and his wife to visit us. We were just about to write the examination to encourage us to talk to us. Professor Reader was doing research on the Makanyas of Southern Natal, staying at Umbumbulu and at Adams College. So I knew him then because that visit was reported by me in the Africa in 1950. So I knew him from that time. So I actually asked him to arrange for me to get to school. And I suggested Umbumbulu Secondary School, which is now Sibusisi, because it was the first school in the rural area outside the boarding schools. The only schools which went beyond Standard 7 in Durban, in the Durban area at that time, was Lorem Secondary School, was Lamondville Secondary School, was Chesterville Secondary School. Hamilton Makanya wrote a letter and gave it to me, which was a great risk, because he knew I was actually indexed. But leaders of those, the educated people of the days were aware of the problems of discrimination in schools. They were aware of the problems of mission schools and the way they treated their students. So I wrote a letter, gave it to me, and I took it to the principal, who admitted me to Mkomi Zulu. And I joined the 3rd year class of junior certificate, taking some, as you well know, the set books. I had to do a complete set of books that I had not done for 1 year. I had to do new subjects which I had not done at Mariatal for 1 year, which I did, and I got a second class pass. In fact, I joined the third year, the school having been opened in 1954, the first group, 55, the second group, and then I was the third group. My eyes were opened at that time. We were aware of what was going on. I was now part of the Youth League of the African National Congress. So at that time, in 1956, Adams College, having been liquidated, followed by the government at all costs for political reasons, was being closed down. It was being taken over by the government. And so in 1957, that was going to be the beginning of the new Adams College under a new name, Amanzimtoti Zulu Training School. Not college, school. I applied, like all others, and I was admitted in 1957. All the old staff, Mr. Grant and the old missionary recruited staff were phased out, and a new staff, mainly from the Transvaal, came to the college. And that is where I trained as a teacher, and we had all sorts of discrimination, and in particular there was the regulation which was stipulating that the white staff and the black staff cannot actually sit in the same staff room, drink tea in the same room. And subsequently, the students' common room, which we liked so much, was taken over to accommodate the black staff. And the area where the staff room was in the same area as the biology laboratory and the scullery, where cups and dishes were washed. And as the Form 5 and the 4 students were moving into the biology laboratory, there they came across Mr. Yap Stridom on the spot with his wife, actually manhandling Mate for having mixed the cups of the white stuff and the black stuff. And then they wrote notes and distributed them throughout the college, the training college, the industrial school, and the high school, to make them aware that an elderly man, almost the ages of many of the students in the school, in other words, in our own Zulu culture, that man is a father to us all, being manhandled by very young white staff members for very silly reasons. That was sufficient for the students to have a mass meeting, but of course the girls were not there because we lived in several centers. It was decided then that we should boycott classes quietly without using any form of violence, to make the principal aware of that there was something wrong going on, and hoping that that was going to end up by the staff, the white staff, realizing that something had gone wrong and they needed to come closer to the students to try and sort out the problems. That never happened. Instead, one of the prefects, Abel Zomu, who was amongst us with the students in the same afternoon, went to inform the secretary of the school, Mrs. Hoskin, what had happened and what the boys had decided to do. And subsequently, the college decided to call the board, which of course, whose chairman was the circuit inspector of the Durban South Circuit. The magistrate was involved. It was still the Department of Native Affairs. And then, because the students decided on the following night to go and punish Abel Zomu, whom they could not get, somebody else was hurt in the confusion of people running out trying to punish him. So that marked the end of my training as a teacher. And at that time, it was during the exam time again, as was the case. It was in October, like Maria Tab. I was expelled. There was a lot of confusion with the expulsion. The police were called in. At one time, they tried to stop the students, but it went on. So that was the end of my life at Adams College, which was followed by my teaching at St. Magdalene's for 1 year, where I was followed by the police, and eventually I had to leave for Basotholand. It was a very exciting feeling. I was really excited because I wasn't aware that I would be recognized. I must say it was the Catholic priests themselves, many of them, and the sisters themselves. Many of them were very good. And in fact, they were very good teachers. But again, those leaders I've referred to, W.Z. Tonko, Moses Mapita, Stephen Dlamini, Masabalala Yengwa, MP Naika. MP Naika, we subsequently met in London. MP Naika was running the newspaper New Age in Lodson House in Grey Street. The very fact that I chose to become a teacher, teachers who taught me were very inspiring people. And the leaders, including Chief Albert Lutuli, and most leaders that we've had, the doctors, had started in the teaching profession. Lutuli, Konko, Uma, Muroka, they all started in the teaching profession. They were very inspiring people. They liked their work and the leadership, their leadership style, and their understanding and the fight that was actually going on representing the people in a very difficult situation, Calabar and subsequently apartheid. In fact, I think by comparison, the leaders who led in the past are not represented today. We must start at the bottom of everything, the children. Now, if you look at what is going on in schools today, the behavior of the teachers, and to a certain extent, and to a large extent, the behavior of the leaders in the government, in politics, which is by far out of the normal situation, particularly in African culture. All we need is to go back to our schools. And for the teachers to teach the children. For the best politician is a teacher. You don't have to be a political leader, but you are a better political leader in teaching and teaching well in school. Culture is one other thing. We've lost so many of our cultural directions that we need to educate the children to respect their elders, to wait for their turn to take leadership and not to demand leadership from those who are adults and who lead. To a great extent, I've been part of the teachers' organizations in Lesotho, Panda, and then the Catholic Teachers Union there. And we worked as professionals to uplift the standard of the African child at the time. There was no such a thing as teachers going on strike, much as we were underpaid. I accept that the teachers have got to be well paid. And in Swaziland, it was the same thing, although today the Swaziland teachers are up in arms against the government, but that is not a normal situation, because they are actually getting at a king who is the head of the state, who is a dictator. And I cannot actually blame the Swazi teachers at the moment. But when it comes to our own situation in South Africa, it becomes very difficult that, for example, an influential and a very strong union, the South African Democratic Teachers Union, which I believe is not influenced by the political leaders. But instead of changing the things for the better, they spend most of the time away from school. And if we can appeal to these teachers to use their influence to help the children to learn, to use their influence to shape the government employees to do their work, so that the children are the ultimate beneficiaries from the school system. An amazing thing is actually taking place now, where the Minister of Education is being taken to task for having failed to deliver books to school. That's not the work of the Minister of Education. In fact, my understanding of the organization and management of education, it's placed at two levels. Organization of education is political, it's administrative, it is the field of the lawmakers to make laws and the regulations which are in turn going to be used by people who are managing schools, because the government itself makes laws and regulations which are to be used by the schools, by the principals. And the system of education only works because the managers are working in schools. Those books which have not been distributed to either the Eastern Cape province or to Limpopo are not the responsibility of the minister. The minister gives instructions to the employees of the department, the superintendents of schools, and so forth, yes, to carry out this. Okay. And until we respect the managers and the principals of the schools, we cannot succeed. But until the managers and the inspectors of school get up on their backside and do their work, we will not succeed. One thing that I managed, particularly on my return to South Africa, was that I gained very useful skills when I returned to this country and worked for the Urban Foundation as a manager for educational development. This actually helped me to understand fundraising. This also helped me to have contacts with the institutions like the Anglo-American Corporation of South Africa, which in the first place paid for my studies in the United Kingdom. And I was in contact with this, and we did a lot of work in schools in the Transvaal. For instance, the school in Niger, in Springs, which was a secondary school and funded by John Deere. It's now named Sibone Secondary School after a very famous professor of education in Soweto. So I learned a lot of things, and by the time I returned to Sibusisiwe, I had the contacts, and I was able to get money from the Anglo-American Corporation of South Africa, from Toyota, and I upgraded the school from the Sugar Association, from Gilbey's, and the improvements that are contained in that booklet, and which was on Sibusisiwe High School, were mainly from this, and the upgrading of teachers. At the time when I got to Sibusisiwe, the teachers were undergraduates, but I encouraged them and they studied them. By the time I left the school, over half of the staff were already graduates. And then the school had no library, and I had the library, and the school at the time was running the waterborne toilets, and I had to find sponsors to buy the engine, the monopumps, to be able to run this. In fact, virtually all the things that I learned in the UK about the school, improvement in two areas, both in physical and in human resources, worked very well, because we worked in Sibusisiwe to try and upgrade the teachers so that they can actually teach well in school. And we also had to find money, which was actually to build the classrooms, because when I got to the school, there were over 1,000 students accommodated in 11 classrooms. And by fundraising, we were able to build 6 new additional classrooms. And the research that I did whilst I was at the Urban Foundation also helped. Toyota used this. It's entitled an examination of the role of the private sector in education in the Republic of South Africa, with special reference to the black population. It is talking about how we should try and work with private sector to get money to uplift the standard of the children, who in turn are used by the same industry as employees. And we seem to get in grips with this because some of the companies were approached, and Toyota is one of them, which assisted us to upgrade Sibusisiwe to become a comprehensive technical high school. That again was an idea which I cherished